Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here in Anaheim. You notice I hardly pause before saying Anaheim. Normally, as a safety measure, I pause before saying where. It's a great pleasure to me to be in, because accidents happen, and when you've been right the way around the world, as I have nearly now, on this second round-the-world trip organized by Veritas, you're liable to think you're still in Australia when in fact you're already in New Zealand. You're liable to find out only too late that Auckland isn't the capital of New Zealand. You're liable to make the most ghastly mistakes of that kind, rather like Winston Churchill, who once stated himself, the most fundamental mistake that any public speaker can make is to say there are three things that you must remember because they're vitally important. The first is this, the second is that, and the third, you've forgotten that. So you must always say there is a number of things that are vitally important. That way you're not going to get tripped up by your own memory. My own memory is, in fact, also not infallible. I found when I was at school that the only lesson that I flunked, the only examination that I flunked at school, in fact, was ordinary level history. I never got in any examination results in history. I never learned to be a historian. I never went to university to learn how to become a historian. When I went to university at London, my intention was to learn how to become a physicist. Pure mathematics, applied mathematics, physics, chemistry, and all the rest of it. And after 3 years of that, then I went to Germany to become a steel worker, to learn the language. I then went back to London University to study economics and political philosophy and a whole basket of other applied arts subjects, statistics, which gave me a very wide, broad background knowledge, which means that I learned a little about a lot, but I didn't learn a lot about any narrow subject. Probably the ideal background if you're going to become a writer or historian, so that I could write books on a very wide number of subjects with knowledgeability. And having learned 8 or 9 languages, as we do in Europe, also relatively fluently, made it advantageous, because I found that when I then set out to work on the Churchill biography, I was able to dispense with the Churchill archives, which is a good thing because the Churchill archives are not available to us. The Churchill family archives are made available to only one historian, Martin Gilbert, and he labors under 2 great disadvantages. Oddly enough, they are disadvantages. The first great disadvantage is that he is, in fact, the chosen historian of the Churchill family. And to be a chosen biographer means that you are hamstrung. You can't really set out, and if you do find anything, if you stumble across anything really unpleasant about the man you're writing the biography about, if you're chosen by the man's family, by his next of kin, by his widow and by his children, then, of course, it's your bounden duty not to reveal this fact. And the other disadvantage that Martin Gilbert labored under, and I don't want this to be regarded in the slightest sense as an anti-Semitic remark, it isn't. Martin Gilbert is one of the chosen in another respect. He's one of the chosen few, which means that he is unable to write the way that I have written, with complete detachment, about Winston Churchill's last pre-war years. Winston Churchill, of course, during those 10 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, was in a state of acute financial depression. He was almost bankrupt. All his stocks and shares were constantly fluctuating in Wall Street, and in 1938 they were totally wiped out in the second Wall Street depression of that month, in February 1938. And he had a colossal expenditure, which he couldn't match with his income as a Member of Parliament. His income as an ordinary British Member of Parliament, just plain Mr. Churchill, not a cabinet minister, no pension. His income was just £500 per annum, about $750 per annum, which is, of course, you cannot support a large house or estate or mansion on, which Churchill did. Churchill had a very large house. And it's rather funny, you know, that the way that when I do these telephone talkback shows, as I have for the last 6 weeks down under, the people who telephone in thinking they're defending Winston Churchill repeatedly trip themselves up. When I was doing a 3-hour talkback show in Auckland, New Zealand, 5 days ago, somebody telephoned in, a dear old woman who telephoned in from a suburb of Auckland, saying that she, in fact, had known Winston Churchill personally. She had been his private secretary for a few days in the middle of 1936, and she had been assigned by a secretarial agency to go and work for him. And she had visited that grand old man in 1936 in his country mansion, Churchill. And she wanted to say what a wonderful, upright, decent, forthright, hard-working, courageous man Winston Churchill was, and every night when he escorted her down the darkened corridors of this ancient English country house, he had given her a little peck on the forehead and said, "Good night, my dear," and that was it. So I then said, "Well, frightfully interesting, madam, but would you now please tell us a little bit about Churchill? How many staff people did you see around there? Nurses, nannies, and gardeners and people?" And she said, "Well, I didn't see very many." I said, "But you presumably there was a nanny there, and a nurse, and a cook, and a housemaid." "Oh, yes, I saw those, but not very many." And I said, what about the gardeners? Oh, there were 3 or 4 gardeners too, because very large grounds, Mr. Irving. What about the ghostwriters who called in to help Churchill write his books? Oh, there were 2 of them too. There was Deacon and there was Bullock, Alan Bullock, of course, later Professor Bullock. And so it went on until gradually we'd built up a list of 30 or 40 people who were on Winston Churchill's payroll. So this lovely old English lady, by her own mouth, had condemned the man she was working for, because she then had to admit she couldn't quite understand how he supported that on an income of £500 a year as a Member of Parliament. So I said, well, now let me tell you a bit, madam, about how Winston Churchill was earning his income. It's in my book, Churchill's War, because I've done a great deal of research on it. The first way he earned money was by writing novels. He wrote War and Peace, he wrote Crime and Punishment, he wrote Jane Eyre, he wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, he wrote Mr. Micawber, he wrote a whole host of novels that we think we've heard of before. He wrote each of these great novels, like War and Peace, which is, of course, a great big Russian blockbuster by Tolstoy. He wrote War and Peace, in fact, in 25 pages of typescript. He accepted the job from the Chicago Tribune Syndicate of digesting each of these great works of English language literature into 25 pages of double-spaced typescript. The idea being to digest each of these articles into one double page of an American newspaper, for which he was paid $1,000. And I hasten to add, he did it very well, because Churchill, writing at his worst, was better than any of us other writers writing flat out at our best. You have to admit that. He's a good writer. But these were potboilers. He was taking the great works of literature and boiling them down to 25 pages of double-spaced typescript. And that is what Churchill was earning his money from in the early 1930s, when he was out of office for those 10 years in the wilderness. When Adolf Hitler came to power, January 1933, our perception now is, of course, Adolf Hitler was busy writing articles, making tireless speeches, rampaging up and down the length and breadth of England and Europe, warning against that man. On the day Adolf Hitler came to power, January the 30th, 1933, as I know from his private literary files, Winston Churchill was busy writing Jane Eyre, a lady's novelette. Writing Jane Eyre, the job took him 1 week, he earned $1,000 for it, and he wasn't in the least bit concerned about Mr. Hitler and what he was doing in Europe. And I know this because all the papers of Churchill's literary agency up in the University of Oregon at Eugene, I'm not quite sure how the Americans pronounce it, and all his literary agents' papers are up there, and there's the manuscript of Jane Eyre, War and Peace, Crime and Punishment, all the other ones, annotated in Churchill's own handwriting, so we know he'd done it. But you won't find it in Martin Gilbert's book, because it's not a very creditable thing to have done, to earn money in that rather humiliating way. And it's not very creditable to find out the other way Churchill was making money in the early 1930s, and this was by faking paintings. He was not painting paintings, he was faking paintings. He was quite a good impressionist painter. We've seen his paintings probably from time to time, illustrated in the newspapers. Mr. Churchill, I suppose his paintings now attract $50,000 or $100,000 a time when they're put up on auction, but in the 1930s they would be lucky to attract $5 or $10 at a time. Nobody wanted paintings painted by an out-of-work British Member of Parliament. So he appended to the bottom right-hand corner of his own paintings the name Charles Morin, M-A-U-R-I-N. And Charles Morin wasn't just any name that he had invented because he liked the sound of it. Charles Morin was in fact an existing French post-impressionist painter who died in 1908 and whose paintings fetched a tidy sum on the French art market. So Churchill sent his own paintings over to Paris, aged a bit, or antiqued, as they say in the business, I believe, and he appended to them the name of an existing, very highly recommended French post-impressionist painter, Charles Morin. And we know he did this because, well, first of all, you'll find out when you read Volume 2, which comes out next September, because the whole story of Churchill's art faking is in there. The only other people who know about it, apart from Winston Churchill and Monsieur Charles Morin, who died in 1908, so he's beyond complaining, were President Roosevelt and myself. President Roosevelt found out the following way. When Churchill made his first visit to the White House in December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, a few days after Pearl Harbor, the head of the American Fine Arts Commission in Washington found out that Churchill was visiting and wrote a letter to him at the White House addressed not to Mr. Winston Churchill, but to Mr. Charles Morin, care of the White House. It's a hilarious letter. I've seen the letter he wrote, addressed in care of the White House, and it says, "Dear Mr. Churchill, dear Mr. Morin, we're so glad to find that you are now visiting the White House. We had believed you were dead. But to find that you are not only still alive, but still turning out paintings is a matter of great joy to us. We will be delighted if you come down to Washington sometime and be our guest, where we will give you some coffee." Coffee cannot exactly have been regarded by Mr. Churchill as a grave inducement. "We'll give you some coffee, and we'd like to discuss some of your better works." A delicately penned letter by this American head of the Fine Arts Commission, which of course was completely lost on the mailroom staff at the White House, who merely registered the fact there was no Mr. Morin living at the White House, and so the letter didn't reach Churchill before he had left in January 1942. And it wasn't until February 1942 that Roosevelt himself pricked up his ears when he heard about this strange letter, realized who it was, and began inquiries. His secretary, Missy Lehand, telephoned the British Embassy to find out what was the pen name that Churchill used as an artist. And 6 weeks later came the telephoned reply that it was Monsieur Charles Morin. You notice the delay. The British Embassy doesn't like to admit it and hopes that Roosevelt has forgotten. But Roosevelt immediately put this in his file, and a note on the telephone call from the embassy identifying the man Morin, and Roosevelt wrote a letter to Scotland Yard notifying them in London that the Prime Minister was an art faker and counterfeiter. A delicious letter which is not in the files you will find, not in the published volumes of Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence, perhaps for obvious reasons. But of course, it's there in the Roosevelt archives, not where you'd expect to find it, and it's a very little-known file kept locked away by the Roosevelt archives in a safe for reasons which I can't deduce. But if you ask for it, you get it. And now the Churchill family is going to get it in volume 2 of this book. This was the second way that Churchill made money. The third way that Churchill made money was when, in 1936, the world's Jewish community came together and decided that they were going to bankroll him and save him. They threw him a lifebelt, so to speak. And the lifebelt which they threw him was called the Focus. The Focus was a little secret pressure group built up especially for Winston Churchill, comprising well-known British politicians who were failures, ex-cabinet ministers and multimillionaires. And this group of British politicians joined together to bankroll Winston Churchill because he was by that time the most potent orator and most brilliant writer and the man who was most pliable in his opinions. So they hired him. You'll find the chapter on that in this book, ladies and gentlemen, is called The Hired Help, which I think is a very apposite title for Winston Churchill, because by 1936 this is what he'd become. He'd become the hired help. And you can see how he fluttered like a weathercock in the wind. In 1920, he was viciously anti-Semitic. He wrote things that were so anti-Semitic that I had to check out the article that he wrote with the bibliographers in Eugene, Oregon, to find out if, in fact, it was a genuine Churchill article or one which has been attributed to him by some malicious person years later. And they wrote back to me saying, regrettably, yes, this viciously anti-Semitic article in 1920 was, in fact, written by Winston Churchill. But by 1936, he's suddenly become not only viciously pro-Jewish, or admirably pro-Jewish, he'd also become a self-confessed Zionist. We know this because I have, thanks to the Israeli government, obtained complete access to the private papers of Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, one of the world's leading Zionists in the pre-war, wartime, and post-war years. The Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel made available to me, as you can ask perhaps later on in question time how I managed to do this, but they supplied to me 500 or 600 pages of photocopies of the entire secret correspondence between Churchill and Weizmann from the 1930s onwards. It's very, very interesting to see the way Churchill describes himself in private to Weizmann, and you compare it with his memoirs, so to speak, written in public for the edification of the British people. It's all very different. And it explains why, in the middle of the 1930s, this new source of money suddenly appeared for Winston Churchill, not just a few pounds at a time. A colossal sum of money was made available to Winston Churchill. In fact, at a dinner party on the 26th of July 1936, the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, a man called Waley Cohen, whose memoirs are written by Henriquez, and which contain a full description of this particular dinner party, they raised a fund of £50,000 sterling in July 1936 for the Focus, this special pressure group that had been set up to aid Winston Churchill. Now, to get £50,000 in 1936 terms, to multiply it up to the present terms, you're going to have to multiply by about 40. So you're looking at $2 million. $2 million made available to Winston Churchill's little private pressure group for no other purpose than to turn his big guns on Nazi Germany. In other words, his job was to whip up and instigate British feeling against the Germans. At that time, of course, in Britain there was very powerful pro-German feeling, particularly among the working classes. And pro-German feelings became even more pronounced at the time of the Nazi-Soviet pact in August 1939. So Churchill had his work cut out, but he did a magnificent job, as you can see by reading the way that slowly but surely the English newspapers led the British public opinion round against the Germans from 1936 onwards. In fact, Churchill himself was the one who coined the phrase, "There's no such thing as public opinion, there's only published opinion." And he went out of his way to butter up the newspaper proprietors like Lord Kemsley, the Berry family, the Telegraph, Lord Rothermere, Lord Beaverbrook, all the big newspaper owners. He tried to butter them up and get them fighting against Germany with him. This fund, this Focus Fund, continued to militate on right through the last years of the 1930s until the outbreak of the war. And then, as rapidly as he had joined it, the Focus suddenly vanished. there are 2 or 3 files in the secret Churchill family on the Focus, but they're not released to us historians. Martin Gilbert's the only one who's allowed to make use of them. He's made virtually no use whatsoever. You can probably deduce why. But we've been able to encircle these archives, these gaps in the archives, by looking at all the other private papers. It stands to reason, ladies and gentlemen, if you are Mr. Winston Churchill, you've got your own private collection of Churchill documents, you're writing letters to President Roosevelt or to Stalin or to Lord Beaverbrook or whatever. Well, we can't see his collection of the carbon copies of his letters, but if we go to the private papers of Stalin and Roosevelt and Beaverbrook, we're going to find the letters that he wrote, particularly if it's the foreign archives. And equally, we're going to find in their papers, we're going to find the carbon copies of the letters that they wrote back to him. So if you go enough around the world, as I have, writing this book, you visit enough foreign archives, you're going to be able to encircle the Churchill archives effectively. You're going to be able to find out what is missing, what we're not being allowed to see, which is what I've done for 10 years. If you remember, I wrote my Adolf Hitler biography for 10 years from 1964 to 1974, and that caused a world uproar, which is still going on. The entire academic world is split down the middle between those who believe me and those who hate me, but still believe me. They can't disbelieve me because the evidence is 100% on my side. From 1974 to 1984, I wrote this book, which is another 10 years' work. And in Austria and New Zealand, of course, it's been very interesting to see over the last 6 weeks the kind of campaign that's been waged against me in the newspapers and in the television. The most common allegation is, oh, Irving is at it again, he's trying to make a controversy in order to become rich. To which my answer is, if you make controversy, that does not make you rich. Neither the Hitler book has made me rich, nor will the Churchill book make me rich, because if you take 10 years to write a book, it stands to reason. 10 seconds thought will tell you. No author can spend 10 years writing a book and expect to become rich. If you spend 10 years writing a book, you become bankrupt, because your publishers start tearing up the contracts, and it doesn't matter what rate of pay you set yourself. Suppose you say $10,000 a year, well, that means the book has got to make $100,000, and so on. You're not going to make it on a book like this. This book makes prestige. This book, above all, provides personal pleasure, because you see the academics, and you see whole segments of the opposing community with egg all over their face, because for 10, 15, 20 years, they've all been proclaiming something without the slightest evidence to back themselves up. I've said this before, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say it again. The academic world does not do research. It's funny, but the only true academics, to my mind, are out here on the extreme right, where some people put me, although I'm not extreme right. In fact, I'm as much extreme left in some respects as I'm extreme right. But the only true academics are the ones like us who do research not because we're told by university to do it, or because we're paid to do it. We do it because we've become slightly obsessed with it, a little bee in our bonnet. We want to find out what's true and what's false. Whereas the academics can't do it, because Professor whoever it is in Melbourne, all the way around Australia, I've come out incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, about universities where the professors have told their students on no account to use my books. 2 universities of the 3 in Sydney, the universities have instructed their students they will be penalised if they use my books. The Australian National University in Canberra, the University La Trobe in Melbourne, those professors have also told their students they will be penalised if they use my books. But equally, there's a number of universities which have instructed their students to use my books. That's in one country alone, in Australia. So you can see the split is beginning wide open. The old traditional professors who are frightened because the students are going to start asking questions they can't answer because they haven't got my sources, and the new progressive universities where the professors are prepared to believe that, well, Mr. Irving, he may have ideas that are crap, but we're prepared to accept that he's got sources that no other academic can afford to obtain. They can't afford to research at a cost of $100,000 or $200,000 the way I have on this book. They can't afford to spend 10 years doing it. If a university professor wants to write a book on Churchill, he goes to the library, takes out 20 books on Churchill and writes book number 21. That's how it is. They just quote each other. 30 professors, 40 professors, all just quoting each other. It's a huge act of incest that they're committing ever since 1945. 5, 10, Professor Borchardt in Munich, he writes some absurd hypothesis about the Holocaust. He adds to the mythology of the Holocaust. And note the word I use, not myth, but mythology. There was a central tragedy, but of course, around that central tragedy, however big it was or however small, there is a colossal mythology has been added on. It's just snowballed over the years. And so Professor Borchardt in Munich, he writes some little original myth, and this is quoted by Professor Jekyll in Stuttgart, which is quoted by Professor Hillgruber in Stuttgart, and Cologne is quoted by Professor Jacobsen in Bonn, and so it goes on. They're all quoting each other, like dogs running around in a circle, sniffing each other's tail, getting faster and faster and faster. They're getting faster and faster, but a huge impression of activity, as we know from the academic world, but of course they're not making any progress across the countryside. They're just all quoting each other. And of course the original professor, Professor Borchardt in Munich, is after a while very flattered to find out that there are 35 other professors all saying the same as him, so it must be true. The fact that they've all quoted him, I mean, you know what it is. It's like gradually this fact that they've cooked up, they've concocted together between them, it takes off. It leaves the ground like a great big Goodyear blimp. It floats around over the countryside with all their names written on it. So it must be true, because they're all worthy, notable members of the academic community, so it must be true. If enough professors say the same thing, it must therefore be true. And that's how it is. That's how the academic world exists, you see, because they exist by quoting each other. A professor who is not quoted by the other professors does not exist. It's a kind of Hegelian philosophical concept, rather like the tree that doesn't exist because you don't hear it fall in the forest. A professor who is not... If I quote you in my footnotes, will you quote me in your footnotes? There's a kind of schoolboy comparison game going on between these professors, and they're all quoting each other frantically in their footnotes until some outsider comes along, you see. Professor Borchardt has blown the initial little bubble, the little soap bubble, which I'm so fond of, and then along comes Jekyll, who puts more hot air in that soap bubble, and then along comes Hilgruber, more hot air, and along comes Jacobson from Bonn. He sees this lovely soap bubble, which is beginning to take off, and he puts more hot air in the soap bubble. And the soap bubble gets bigger and bigger. 40 professors all saying the same thing, and it's beautiful, and it's colourful, and it must be true, but it begins to wobble unstably. You know the way soap bubbles get. They wobble, they oscillate, they vibrate, they tremble, and they're all beginning to get nervous in case some idiot comes along and pricks it. And I am that prick. I've got the documents. Here. In Australia, ladies and gentlemen, where the folk are very simple, a dear old lady came up to me after I delivered this lecture and said, Mr. Irving, I'm going to have to tell you, we do have problems with the English language down here. You know, up there, I'm sure words have only one meaning. And so she went on, and I said, Madam, I'm deeply aghast. Does this word have another meaning? She said, well, yes, it does, but I don't. And I said, can you draw me a picture then? We have pictures in this traveling brochure I carry around with me, because a lot of the documents are so absolutely clear beyond peradventure. You can see it's a glossy brochure because it glosses over the things that are unfavorable in my life. And here we have, I mean, it's obviously written by me because the headline is Irving was right. But here in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got this lovely document on the Holocaust, which is the prick. It's the one which shows that all their theories can't be wrong, can't be right. They must have got it wrong. Here, you see, this is 1942. We know that the little central Holocaust tragedy has begun already. But here's Adolf Hitler telling the Minister of Justice, or rather the head of the German Civil Service, Lammers, telling the Minister of Justice, the Führer has repeatedly ordained that he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. It's a genuine document. It's in the files of the German Ministry of Justice, and yet the historians can't explain it. The academics can't explain why Hitler is apparently saying in the middle of 1942, let's postpone it all until after the war's over. Because, of course, the historians have been proclaiming all along this already long begun, whatever it was. The final solution has long begun. So Irving must be right. Hitler had no idea what it was and had no idea that it had started. Therefore, it was a purely ad hoc tragedy, a massacre started by hundreds of mindless gangsters acting on their own, same as it happens in every war, like Lieutenant Calais and My Lai, and so on and so on and so on. But, of course, this is unacceptable because the modern accepted version, which in some countries you are not allowed to challenge, because if you do challenge it, for example, in West Germany, you go to prison. The modern accepted version is Adolf Hitler ordered the killing of 6 million Jews in Auschwitz. And anything which challenges accepted version is unpalatable. So the historians don't quote this document, they drop it on the floor, they push it under the carpet, and they hope that nobody notices. And that's the soap bubble that I talk about. And when somebody then comes along and pricks the soap bubble, and they've all got egg and soap all over their faces, all they can then do is say, ladies and gentlemen, he's a fascist, he's a neo-fascist, he's a neo-Nazi, we don't listen to him. Students, don't listen to Irving, don't read his books, whatever you do. If you do quote his books in your term papers, you will be penalized, you may even have to lose your university place. It's funny, isn't it? They can't last much longer, of course, because gradually the university professors are coming around to my point of view. The big names in the academic world already split right down the middle between those who believe me and finally accept that the documents probably do tell the truth, and the lesser names who cling to the old belief because, well, why do professors cling to the old belief? The answer is that the professors, bless their hearts, have realized one truism from university life, and this is that no professor has ever been sacked for swimming with the stream. So they all swim with the stream because that way they feel safe. But they feel the stream is getting narrower. The water is getting colder. And it's going to get a lot colder now they've got the Churchill book, because having asked logical questions on Hitler and the Holocaust, and it's the logical questions that people always overlook, I've now started asking logical questions about Churchill and World War II. You see, the logical question on Hitler and the Holocaust was this. If we accept this version, this Hitler, the 6 million, Auschwitz, and so on, if we accept that version, then we ask the simple logical question, if you're going to kill 6 million Jews, and this has been part of your party program ever since you came to create it back in 1922, 1923, 24, if this has always been your intention, why then do you have that major railroad transport movement in 1941, 1942, picking up the Jews in Amsterdam and Brussels and Paris and shipping them all the way across Europe to the Eastern territories where you liquidate them? Why don't you just liquidate them on the spot without the expensive transport program? Because you're short of transport, you're busy fighting World War II, you've got desperate battles going on outside Moscow, you need every truck and every piece of rolling stock you can to send musketeers and riflemen and ammunition and food to the Eastern Front for these desperate winter battles. So why the transport movement if you're going to kill them anyway? You see, this is the logical question that nobody has addressed themselves to in the academic world, because they all believe the old existing version. And of course the logical answer is Adolf Hitler ordered the transport program, the geographical solution that was always his idea, shifting the Jews out of Europe and putting them somewhere else, where they couldn't be a nuisance to anybody and where nobody could be a nuisance to them. I mean, we've had various ideas that Hitler put up at the time. The Tanganyika solution was one. Another one was Madagascar. He was going to send them to Madagascar. Another one was Western Australia. They were bothering our friend Raymond P. White and Veritas, no doubt, in Western Australia, but we could care, right? And another one was putting them finally in the Eastern Territories, which is where the final solution was, the Eastern Territories. We were going to put them in the Eastern Territories. Hitler ordered it, the train started rolling, and nobody really bothered very much about what the gangsters on the spot were doing. A lot of them, of course, survived. And this is of course, the other logical question now. Auschwitz, suppose it was this ruthless extermination center of the Nazis. And we all know how ruthless and dedicated and systematic and efficient the German Nazis were. But these Jews went to Auschwitz, and they have survived. They were in the jaws of death, the death machine, the ruthless Nazi brutal extermination machine, yet somehow there are thousands of them surviving. There was millions. I'm glad if there are millions, and I'm even gladder, of course. There was a photograph in the Sydney Morning Herald the other day, a half-page article about a man whose play on Adolf Eichmann is a big hit in the Australian theatre. Not quite as big a hit as our Churchill book is now in the Australian bookshops, but still quite a big hit. And there's a photograph of this author who's written a play called Eichmann in Jerusalem or something like that, and the photograph of the author had the caption, "His parents survived." Good, his parents survived. I mean, but this is the great mystery, the strange puzzle about the Holocaust is that these people went. I did a German television program. You remember the Holocaust television series, which was staged. I managed to get onto the panel of discussion on German television, Westdeutsche Rundfunk, at the end of that, a 3-hour discussion program. They found out too late who I was, and they couldn't cancel it because my name had been announced in the newspapers. And that Sunday, we were all allowed to meet for lunch before the evening program. And if I can just go ahead a little bit, that Sunday evening there were 10,000 organized communists protesting outside the television studios with banners saying Westdeutsche Rundfunk is making Irving salonfähig, which means acceptable, clean, salonfähig. Anyway, at lunch we were all allowed to meet, and one of the ladies there, Frau Rupprecht, or no, Frau Harprecht, I said Frau Harprecht turned out to have been in Auschwitz, an Auschwitz survivor. And she's a big name in German television now, she's Jewish of course. And as we were discussing which way the conversation should go when the cameras were turned on that evening after the Holocaust final program, I said, Frau Harprecht, what I would like to say is I think a lot of viewers back in Germany would just like to hear you describe everything you actually saw with your own eyes. After all, you're an Auschwitz survivor, and there are not many of them who've actually got such clear recollections probably as yourself. Why don't you just tell the audience everything that you yourself saw? This must be interesting for the 20 million television viewers who are going to be tuned in that night. And she was a bit flattered, and she said, well, yes, although it's very painful, of course, I don't like discussing it. This is, of course, the first evasion. What she probably herself saw was probably the laundry or something like that. I don't know. She probably saw one tiny camp, one tiny corner of this huge industrial complex, this synthetic rubber factory. But then when I went on to say the following, I said, you see, Frau Harprecht, when you finish describing it, I would like also then to ask this question. Isn't your existence in front of the cameras tonight a living flesh and blood proof that all is not well with the Holocaust mythology, which gives us the picture of Auschwitz as being a ruthless, dedicated extermination center, and Adolf Hitler as being a man bent on liquidating every single living Jew. And she said, I don't understand what you're saying. And so I said, Frau Harprecht, there are many people like you, and I'm glad of it. There are millions and millions of survivors, and I'm puzzled about why. And she said, producer, Herr so-and-so, if Mr. Irving asks this question tonight in front of the cameras, I shall get up and storm out of the studio. I've never been so... And in this way, the producer turned appealingly to me and said, Mr. Irving, please don't ask this question tonight. Now, let me make quite plain so there's no misunderstandings. I'm not challenging the Holocaust. In this word that's now become a kind of trademark. I sometimes expect to see the word the Holocaust with TM after it, as though it applies only to one specific tragedy. There were very many tragedies in World War II, and as I've gone round the whole of Down Under on television, coast to coast, wall to wall television, they couldn't get away from me. My face on the television screens night after night, thanks to Raymond White and Veritas. As I said again and again, the tragedy of World War II wasn't the killing of Jews or the killing of gypsies or the killing of homosexuals or whatever. The real tragedy of World War II was the killing of innocents, innocenticide. That is a word that I've created, I have coined, and I think it is sufficiently general not to offend anybody at all. Jews come into it, of course. If there were any innocent Jews and they were killed, then they, of course, become victims of this crime of innocenticide. The crime was not that they were killed because they were Jewish. The crime is that they were killed and they were innocent. And, of course, if you then enlarge the crime to the killing of innocents, the Germans weren't the only people guilty of this crime. It then slops over a bit onto some of the other victorious powers like your own, President Roosevelt, and what happened in Hiroshima, Nagasaki. When we know a little bit more about that, we begin to find grave parallels. So I'm not challenging any of the central core stories of the Holocaust. There was a huge tragedy of some kind or other. I do challenge, however, the version which has been so glibly presented that Adolf Hitler himself ordered it. And just as we were conned about that particular tragedy, so we've been conned about Winston Churchill and World War II. There's no question at all. World War II, I mean, you only have to look at certain logical issues that are raised by World War II from an English point of view. Why were we fighting in it? And you ask the British this and the man in the street, and they come up immediately with three different answers. The first answer they say is, well, of course we had to fight it because of Poland. But instantly there's another man next to him who says, no, it wasn't Poland, it was because of defending the British Empire. And those two are shouted down by the third one. He says, of course, we had no choice but to fight because we were fighting the devil incarnate, Adolf Hitler. So you've got three excuses for fighting, three war aims. But, of course, the Poland one is completely baloney because by the end of 1939, Poland had ceased to exist and nobody was defending Poland. Nobody was fighting on behalf of Poland by the time the war ended. In fact, we were rather fighting against Poland's interests. I think if any nation suffered from World War II, it was Poland. So they had no cause to thank the British or the Americans or anybody else for coming to their rescue. In fact, if we hadn't fought on behalf of Poland in 1939, I think personally Poland and the Poles, as human beings, would have been very much better off. This is, by the way, the main thing which I'm concerned with is Churchill. When he came to power in May 1940, he invented a new war aim. We are fighting to defend the British Empire, he said. And this war aim militated onwards throughout 1940, 1941. 2 years long, Churchill was able to proclaim this as being the war aim, the reason to carry on fighting, the reason for prolonging the war. If we don't fight on, effectively, Hitler will invade the British Empire and we have to defend it. And of course, at the end of 1941, you couldn't have that war aim any longer because the Americans are in the war. And you're not going to get one GI to go to the battlefield to defend the British Empire. So, but imperceptibly, rather like wall-to-wall carpeting, you can't see where the join is, but the colour somehow at the other end of the wall has changed. Imperceptibly, we have a new war aim, and this one now is, we're not fighting for Poles or British Empire, we're fighting the devil incarnate, Nazism, or putting it in a positive light, we are fighting for freedom, civilization, and all that we hold dear, capital letters all the way through, all that we hold dear. Well, of course, this sounds jolly good until you realize what the Americans were making us do for it. The Americans weren't rushing into battle to defend the British Empire and all that we hold dear, whether it's British or not. The Americans were doing it for money. And I'm going to be rude to those of you Americans who are here now, although you probably realize this yourselves. If you ever wondered why you are now rich and we are now poor, don't let appearances deceive you. I'm extremely poor. The reason is this. You took us to the cleaners, and I don't mean Sketchley Brothers. You took us to the cleaners from 1941 onwards, and you did it very efficiently, and you did it so sneakily that the British people never found out. It went like this. Imagine I'm walking down the street and I see an old lady on the other side of the street being mugged stupid by niggers, by people of a different race on the other side of the road, and she's being mugged absolutely blind by these two. We rush across the road. We rush across the road and we say, "Madam, let me help." This is what you say if you're in America. "Madam, let me help." And she said, "Oh, thank you so much. I'm being mugged stupid by these two gentlemen." And you say, "But madam, I see you've got a handbag there. Before I help you, give me all your small change." This is what the Americans did to us in the first half of 1940. They took all our small change. Everything we had in cash and movables they took. And then we notice, of course, at the bottom of the handbag is her checkbook. So we say, "Madam, I'd like to help you a great deal, and all of you, old dear, I'd like to help you, but would you not mind writing out a check for every penny you got in the bank, too?" This is what President Roosevelt did to us from 1940 onwards. In December 1940, after Roosevelt had taken every pound and every dollar and every French franc and Deutschmark that we had, every ounce of foreign currency that we had, Roosevelt had taken out of our bank. And after he'd taken all our gold, and after Roosevelt had found out that we still had 28 million pounds or so of gold left in South Africa belonging to Britain, he sent a battleship to Simonstown Naval Base in South Africa to pick up our last remaining gold. He then found out that the old lady still has a checkbook in the bottom, and he asked us to clean out all the foreign investments we've got. And then she finds out that she's got some old stocks and shares too lying around, or he suspects it, and he says, "Madam, do you have any stocks and shares you can sell up in a hurry?" And she's kind of going like this and says, "Well, yes, I think I have. And he says, "Well, if you promise to do that, then I'll think about helping you." That's what the Americans did to us in 1941. There's no question at all. If you read the Morgenthau papers, which are in the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, Roosevelt took us to the cleaners. He made us give up all our money, all our gold, sell up all our stocks and shares, everything we had. Every investment we had in the United States and in South America, including everything in the Western Hemisphere, had to be sold off before the end of 1941, beginning with the Viscose Corporation of America, which was British, worth 150 million pounds in 1941, sold to 35 million pounds to the Morgan Bank in Wall Street. You notice the difference between value and the actual money you get? Well, that's how it is, isn't it? If you're a little bit hard up, all your friends club round and help you. And Bill Jones down the street buys your colour TV for $15, and the other neighbour on the other side of the road says, "I'll give you $7 for your record player," and somebody else buys your grand piano for $20, and they're all kidding themselves they're helping you out. They are, of course, they're helping you out of everything you've got. And that's what the Americans did with us, with the British, from 1941 onwards. But Winston Churchill concealed it from us, and he actually avowed his intention of concealing it from us, because when Morgenthau went to see him in August 1944, as you see from Churchill's diary, which I've got, when Morgenthau went to see Churchill on the 4th of August 1944, had lunch with him, Morgenthau said to Mr. Churchill, "Prime Minister, how you intend breaking it to the British people that you've bankrupted them by fighting this war?" And Churchill's reply was, "That is a doleful task that I propose to leave to my successor." But he didn't tell us, and his successor Clement Attlee didn't tell the British either. The British people never found out that to fight Churchill's war, which is the war from 1940 onwards to the end, 1945, had bankrupted us, had cost us all our overseas investments, had reduced Britain to penury. Everything which 300 years of British empire building had built up had gone, and we never found out. The British people never told. And people, you can sucker an entire public. It's happening today over South Africa. It's happening today in countless places around the world. You can sucker an entire public into believing something different. Because, as Churchill himself said, there's no public opinion, only published opinion. And we know who controls the press worldwide, which is what I'm going to come on to in the last part of my talk, what we're going to do about that. So you see, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, if you go to London now, you'll find the English people there in all their old imperial arrogance. The glint of imperial wisdom in their eye. They believe the empire is out there somewhere. Not lost, just mislaid temporarily. You've only got to go down the road to the lost empire. You know, you're going to get it back. And the evidence is all those lovely tourists from the empire visiting at this moment. 6 million of them, some of them have been there 20 or 30 years now, not behaving very nicely. This is true, but we accept their petrol bombs and whatever else they throw at us. We accept it because it's the proof that the empire is out there somewhere. And this is why we gentle English folk put up with this humiliation. And it is a humiliation, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, it's a terrible humiliation. What's happened now to Britain? You go back to Britain and your passport, as an Englishman, your passport is checked by a Pakistani passport control officer. This isn't an exaggeration. You will find that the odds are over 80% that you will have a passport officer who's Pakistani checking an Englishman's passport, somebody born in England 50 years ago, and a recent Commonwealth immigrator is finding out if you're invalid to come in or not. How long do you intend staying in England, sir, he will say. And I say, get lost, I was born here 50 years ago. This is the humiliation of Britain because we haven't had a government, there's a democratic government in Britain for the last 50 years. By democratic government, I mean a government which does what the people want. Nobody asked the British people in the last 20 or 30 years, do you want us to allow things to happen that will completely change the face of Britain? And of course it's happened. The British people were never asked, and it has happened. And of course it happens in the United States exactly the same. Things happen in the United States and you are not asked. You're paying out colossal sums of money to states around the world, fighting strange wars without powers being granted to the president. All sorts of strange things are happening, and yet you're not asked. And you're kidded that this is democracy. Your strange democratic process in the United States results in you ending up with people like Jimmy Carter, and you're told this is the finest American citizen that we can produce. Obviously, there's something wrong with the democratic systems around the world. Winston Churchill, of course, wasn't a product of a democratic system at all. He foisted himself upon the British people in May 1940, and we rapidly disembarrassed ourselves of that gentleman in May 1945 when the end of the war came, because the British people in their wisdom saw that they didn't want Winston Churchill to continue in office one moment longer. The damage, of course, by that time was done. 5 years in office of this drunken gentleman, and he had disembarrassed Britain of an empire and of all their assets. Nothing was left. You may wonder why I use the word drunk about Churchill, and the answer is not only that he was just occasionally slightly tipsy, the way lots of people probably get. He had a congenital problem. He inherited it from his father. He passed it on to his son, Randolph Churchill, a very famous writer. He passed it on to his daughter, Sarah Churchill, who was constantly being locked up as drunk and disorderly and put away in Holloway Women's Prison in the centre of London, although her father was Prime Minister. And Randolph, in turn, passed on this congenital defect to his son, the President Winston Churchill. It's a great tragedy, and normally you don't make anything out about it. It's like when you find out there's a congenital defect in the family, you don't exactly go running around making capital out of it. But Winston Churchill wasn't just drunk in charge of an automobile, he was drunk in charge of an empire, drunk in charge of a country, and he took decisions in an intoxicated state that very often cost the lives of tens of thousands of empire and Commonwealth citizens. A matter of great indifference to yourselves as Americans, of course. In fact, it probably came to a great advantage to Americans, because if we'd had a real man as Prime Minister, if we'd had a Prime Minister who was not like Winston Churchill, himself half American, which is something the English all too often forget, then England would now be the predominant force in the world, and not yourselves, not the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, Winston Churchill, unfortunately from my point of view, of course, unfortunately Winston Churchill sold out to the Americans because he saw no reason not to. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, Roosevelt looked up from his office table in the Oval Office of the White House and said, well, I suppose he's the only man the British have for the job, but it's a pity because he's a drunken bum. And these are the quality of the documents I've got. You never heard quotations like that, but if you've got enough private diaries from around Churchill and around Roosevelt, you know exactly what's been said. At the beginning of the chapter called Chapter 20, Tit for Tat in this book, you see Sumner Welles, who was the Deputy Undersecretary of State here in the United States in 1940. Sumner Welles visited Europe in March 1940 to make a desperate attempt to get peace. He visited Hitler, he visited Mussolini, he visited Chamberlain, he visited their undersecretaries, and he visited Winston Churchill. March the 12th, 1940, he found Winston Churchill blind drunk behind the boardroom table in the Admiralty with an empty bottle of whiskey on the table. And Sumner Welles wrote in his report, 12 pages long. He began the report by saying, Winston Churchill received me in a state of complete intoxication, a bottle of whiskey empty at the side of him on the table, incoherent, unable to speak. And at the end of the 12 pages, he then writes, by this time 90 minutes had passed, and Winston Churchill had become somewhat more sober. A scandalous state of affairs, you might think, for somebody with the lives of tens of thousands of British sailors in his hands, Winston Churchill. But more serious was the fact that Sumner Welles went back to America and told everybody what he had seen. There was a side result, I write, of the Sumner Welles meeting with Churchill that did great harm. Wells put it about official Washington that the famous Englishman was an alcoholic. He told Ickes that Churchill was a drunken bum. He told Burley, that's Adolph Burley, the State Department, that he'd found the First Lord of the Admiralty quite drunk. He was explicit about it in his report to Roosevelt, which I just mentioned. The latter passed it around North America. Roosevelt regretted to the visiting Prime Minister of Canada that Winston seemed to be drinking too much. He amplified this a few days later to the remark that Churchill is tight most of the time. This is shameful, wrote Prime Minister Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, scandalized in his diary. This is shameful that he should have been in this condition when Sumner Welles went to see him. It's that arrogance and the assumed there's nothing wrong with arrogance. I've always said that it's being arrogant that makes us British great, of course. We go to great expense and trouble to make our children arrogant. If we sent our children to Eton and they came back without arrogance, we demand a refund, I think. That isn't exactly what the complaint was against Churchill. The complaint was that he was drunk. And the interesting thing is, and I draw this to the attention of those of you who are historians or academics, either listening at this moment or listening later on to this tape. If you go to the archives and you get out the volumes of the Foreign Relations of the United States, which are the publications by the US government printing office of the State Department papers, you'll find Sumnerwell's report, this diplomat's report on his visit to Churchill. And not a mention of Churchill's drunkenness. It's been cut out. But if you go to the Roosevelt archives in Hyde Park, in New York State, you find Roosevelt's report from Sumnerwell, the original document Sumnerwell signed with those sentences included. This is why I never use published volumes. I never use diaries that have been printed somewhere else. I never use the printed volumes of documents, because you can be absolutely certain that the bits that are vital to an understanding of history have been cut out. If you look in the British Cabinet minutes, for example, even if you go into the archives in Britain, you find this. If you go into look in the British Cabinet minutes in 1940, June 1940, you'll find important paragraphs have been blanked out. You're not given the original Cabinet minutes, although it's over 50 years ago nearly. 47 years ago now, 1940, and there's a 30-year rule operating in England which says we can see all documents over 30 years old. We don't have a Freedom of Information Act, but something very similar in that respect, as far as it's over 30 years ago. If you see the War Cabinet minutes, you find that certain paragraphs have been blanked out in the photocopies, so you can't read them. And it's only when you go and look in the private diaries of people like Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, or Lord Beaverbrook, or Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister, that you find out what Churchill was saying that afternoon. I've quoted it here in this book, and you'll find it's interesting that when Adolf Hitler made his great peace plan in the summer of 1940, which none of the other academics have heard about, and at present they're down in Australia now tearing their hair out. We've left the whole of Australia on fire with this book, ladies and gentlemen. They're tearing each other's hair out. They're screaming blue murder. The newspaper columns, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Melbourne Age, the press, all over Australia is in flames now, with people defending the book and people attacking it, which is how I like it. We've set a cat among the pigeons. Or as the Germans say, ein Hecht in Karpfenteich. So the important thing is that summer of 1940, Winston Churchill in Cabinet said, I think that we would be wrong not to accept Mr. Hitler's peace offer. It's not just David Irving saying it. In other words, Winston Churchill himself said it in that Cabinet meeting, which is why it's been blanked out so we can't read it. Because it's embarrassing for us to have to admit now, 47 years later, to anyone who can find the original quotations by Churchill in Lord Halifax's diary, that we could have got out of the war in 1940 with the British Empire intact. Not only that, of course, the Jews down in Australia screaming blue murder at me and saying, there's Irving again, he's whitewashing Hitler. He's denigrating that fine man, and he's whitewashing Hitler. He's up to his usual tricks. Just what's to be expected of a neo-fascist and a Nazi and all the rest of it. So I said, wait a minute, gentlemen, brethren, wait a minute. I say, pay attention to what I'm saying. Watch my lips. If the war had ended in 1940, how many of those 6 million, or whatever figure you say is the right one, would have died? Because all of them, whoever died, however many it was, from 1940 onwards, they all died in that period from 1940 onwards. If they all died in that period from 1940 onwards, if the Holocaust had, if the war had ended, the other Holocaust, Mr. Churchill's Holocaust, if that had ended in 1940, in June, then the trademarked Holocaust, the killing of millions of innocent people, whatever side, German, French, Poles, Belgians, Hungarians, the bombing war, the extermination of minorities, whatever it was, wouldn't have taken place. And then this, of course, is rather confusing for our position because they haven't thought of this. And there's nothing more embarrassing to be confronted with an obvious solution that you haven't thought of. This is why the smear tactics begin, of course, why they've been frantically trying to catch up with lost ground in Australia for the last 6 weeks. First of all, they've been saying Irving is a fascist, then they've been saying the book is rubbish, and then they've been saying, well, of course, he's got good sources, and then they look around and say, who let him in anyway? Who let him in? The same thing happened in New Zealand. Telephone calls to the New Zealand public radio service there saying if we had had our way, Irving wouldn't have been given a visa to come in. It was touch and go, and I say this in this small confidential circle, fully aware that nothing of this will go any further. That when you go to New Zealand, you had to fill in a declaration saying that you've never been arrested or deported from anywhere. And any of my enemies could easily have gone to the magazines. They could have gone to the authorities with my own traveling brochure with a photograph of me being arrested and deported from Austria. Here, arrested in Vienna and deported. But then, of course, they would have had to admit that in the bottom paragraph, it shows that 2 years later, after fighting manfully through the Viennese law courts, the Austrian government was forced to cringingly apologize to me and pay me colossal compensation for having wrongfully arrested me and wrongfully deported me. So I'm interested to see what will happen next if the New Zealanders try to keep me out on that account next time. But this is the methods they have to use. The interesting thing is, the book has now been on sale in Australia, how long? September the 12th to today, 5 weeks. And all the newspaper articles have been dedicated to attacking me, or to attacking Raymond White, or perhaps more justifiably to attacking certain other people, but not dedicated to attacking what is in the book at all. They can't attack it because the archives are on our side. And they're baffled by the fact that they hadn't themselves spotted that in Winston Churchill's file on Dunkirk, again, you're only given a bound volume of photocopies, you're not given the original file in the archives, all the way through of blank pages interspersed, which they had always assumed, I suppose, the other academics had assumed how nice of the British archivists to put in blank pages to keep the documents apart. But if you look closer, you see that the blank pages are numbered too. So obviously they are inserted in place of documents that have been taken out. And then the academics, they say to themselves, well, never mind, who knows, it's probably unimportant material. But of course it's the embarrassing documents that have been removed. And the only way to find out what's been removed in the Dunkirk file is to do what I did, which is to go and see the widow of the French Prime Minister of 1940. Still alive, Monsieur Paul Reynaud, he died years ago, but his widow is still alive, a dear old one-armed lady who doesn't very much like her husband because her late husband was a notorious womanizer and in fact decapitated one of his previous womenfolk in a car accident a few days after Mr. Churchill said, poor Madame Laporte, I think she's losing her head. Most unfortunate because that's what then happened. It's all referred to in a footnote here, a little academic footnote. And if you go to the archives, as I did, I persuaded Madame Paul Reynaud, the disenchanted widow, to use her one remaining good arm to sign a document authorizing me to go and see her husband's papers in the French National Archives, and lo and behold, there are some of the letters that we have so tediously removed from Mr. Winston Churchill's file so that no historian can read them. And when you read them, then you find out the true story about Dunkirk. Or a month later, you find out also the true story about why we British sank the French fleet at Oran, or as the French call it, Mers el-Kabir. We sank the fleet of our own allies deliberately. We went in there and bombarded it, killing 2,000 French sailors on July the 3rd, 1940, because Mr. Churchill made a translation mistake. His French was never very good. On this occasion, he made a catastrophic translation mistake with the regular French word contrôle, which doesn't mean control, it means supervision. But Churchill got it wrong. He ordered the French fleet sunk, and he's probably hoping against hope in his grave even now that no one spotted this schoolboy translation mistake he made. Somebody has. The prick. Me. It's in the book. It's in the book. The whole chapter is called A Misunderstanding Between Friends. So you see, this book is going to revolutionize the writing of Winston Churchill. One radio interviewer said to me, Mr. Irving, what do you hope you've achieved for listeners by writing this book about Churchill? I said, they can clear out all their other Churchill books and get just this one because it's going to take up less space, and they're going to find it takes much less time to read this book than to read all the other ones, and they're going to learn a lot more truth and wisdom. And that's the way it's going to be, because they may not like my conclusions from what but they can't deny the fact that I've got the sources that they are. Look at just inside, not even on page 1. Look on the inside of the cover, and you see Churchill's diary. It was on his desk throughout the war, all the way through. There's this volume ends in June 1941. It was on his desk throughout the war. He hasn't got it anymore. It was stolen from him in the closing months of the war, in the closing days of the war, in fact, by his bodyguard, his Scotland Yard detective, Commander Tommy Thompson. Stole it. The family still has it. Commander Tommy Thompson is now dead, but his godson has it. And the godson, knowing that I was going to spend a lot of money doing the research on this book, came and offered it to me for £250,000, the Churchill diaries. Nobody else has ever used them. They're vital. I had the same kind of thing for the Hitler book. You need to know what somebody's doing minute by minute, day by day, throughout the day in order to be able to draw certain conclusions. And the son said to me, Mr. Irving, I want you to have these diaries because I'm so deeply impressed by the work you did on Hitler. I think you're the only true researcher for truth. And I had the impression he was going to let me have the diaries, but somehow over the next few days the figure of £250,000 was mentioned. And I don't have that kind of money, but I didn't want to admit that I didn't have that kind of money, so I got on my English high horse and I said, I'm frightfully sorry, but if you expect to sell me stolen property, I'm afraid I'm not in the market. We don't buy stolen property. I will rent it from you. I've rented the diaries from him for £5,000, and that's why I am the only author who's ever made use of them. The others can't afford to have them. Commander Tommy Thompson's godson, I think, has now split them up, and he's selling them on the American autograph market, so they're now vanished for all time. I've got a very good microfilm copies, which I'm prepared to make available to the archives in due course. The important thing about having somebody's diary is you can draw conclusions like, for example, that the man Winston Churchill was a blubbering coward. Again, a most unattractive and unfavourable conclusion. Here's the Churchill diary here. I've just published here an excerpt of it. I can enlarge it slightly for you here. November 1940. In fact, it's the day of the famous raid on Coventry. November the 14th, 1940, 2 days before Churchill had been told by the Air Ministry Intelligence Service, the code breakers, we have decoded a German Air Force signal which says that there's going to be the biggest series of air raids ever on London. That's the conclusion we draw. Operation Moonlight Sonata, beginning on the first full moon night. The entire German Air Force is going to bomb night after night after night, day after day after day for 3 days and 3 nights, with Hermann Goering personally in charge. 1,000 bombers will obliterate the entire target. What is this target going to be, he says. And the Air Ministry says, well, target number 1 we couldn't decode. It's corrupt in the original telegram. Target number 2 is outer London. Target number 3 is the Thames Estuary. Target number 4 is the home counties around London. So it stands to reason target number 1 is the very centre of London going to be obliterated. Churchill draws on his desk calendar a bracket covering those 3 days. You can see it down the side. No appointments in London. The afternoon comes, November the 14th. He scurries out of the back garden gate, not out of the famous front door of number 10 Downing Street, but out of the back garden gate. There's a photograph of him scurrying out of that garden gate in our book. We managed to locate a photograph of him doing this to where his big black car is waiting. The big black bomb-proof Daimler. Try saying that, big black bomb-proof Daimler, right. He scurries into the car, gets into it, and is about to drive off when a dispatch rider drives up with a message from the Air Ministry. He's in a hurry to get out of London before dusk falls, and the bombers arrive. So he tells the driver, drive off, and he drives off, and he opens the message. And it's a message, only a few lines long, from the Air Ministry saying, Prime Minister, this afternoon at 3 o'clock, our radio intelligence planes detected where the German blind bombing beams intersect. They don't intersect over London, but they intersect over Coventry, 100 miles further north. It's the famous Coventry raid. Right. Churchill says, driver, back to number 10 Downing Street. You see, he wants to go. As he gets back to number 10 Downing Street, goes through the door, his staff greet him with astonishment. You notice he hasn't told his staff to take the day off the next 3 days to go and play golf in the countryside somewhere. He's left the whole of London waiting there because he doesn't care really what happens to them. He has betaken his own little portly self out into the countryside, and he's going to leave everybody else to sweat it out. Operation Moonlight Sonata. But that isn't all. His staff say to him, Winston, why did you come back? And he says, I have just received this doleful piece of intelligence from the Air Ministry, and he shows them the empty envelope. I know this from Sir John Martin, his private secretary. I've just received this doleful piece of intelligence from the Air Ministry saying that tonight there is to be a vicious and barbarous Nazi attack on London. An attack on London, he says. And it would not be right for me to allow the citizens of this fine metropolis to believe that I am so coward and craven that I'm not prepared to put up with their trials and tribulations which they are asked to suffer night after night in the name of all that we hold dear. This is the true Winston Churchill, and that night he actually goes up on the roof of number 10 Downing Street, unbuttons his waistcoat, tucks his thumbs into his waistcoat, and says, let these bombers come and do their worst. I am prepared for them. Knowing full well, of course, that at that very moment the Nazi bombers were unloading their cargoes of death over Coventry, 100 miles to the north. We must not forget, in reading history now, what we've known ever since 1975 publicly, but I've known it some years before then, that Winston Churchill was one of the very few people who was reading Hitler's secret signals, the Enigma secret. Our computer code breakers were breaking the German Air Force code ever since May 1940. And this tells us not only that Winston Churchill knew night after night what was the real target. In fact, I've quoted in here, and you'll find it, ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Air Force Fighter Command War Room Log, in other words, the war diary of the Fighter Command Forces, showing that in 90 or 95% of the cases, he had a deep underground bunker that he could take refuge in. He had another shelter, a Down Street station. He didn't mind, but he still wanted to go 150 miles outside London to the estate of Mr. Ronald Tree, one of the millionaire members of the Focus, this group I mentioned earlier, because there he was going to take refuge and return the next morning to show himself to the British people who would adore him and say, good old Winnie. Look at the chapter called Good Old Winnie, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who have the book. Let me read a few pages from the opening, a few lines from the opening. You'll see how this did his popularity good. You see, he was a very unpopular politician. But now suddenly the bombing of England has begun and he's become popular because of it. And what does this tell us? Cui bono? Whom does it benefit? The answer is it benefited Churchill. He deliberately provoked the bombing of London, as we now know from the Royal Air Force telegrams and the Royal Air Ministry, the Air Ministry's signals and the Bomber Command signals and war diaries, which contain the actual records of his telephone conversations. He deliberately provoked the bombing of London because he needed it for political reasons. Until now, we're now talking about September 1940, when the Germans began bombing London. 1 year after the war began, Hitler finally decided he wasn't going to forbid the bombing of London any longer. Churchill had known all the time that Hitler had forbidden bombing London, that Hitler had forbidden dropping any bombs on British targets at all, town targets at all. Until now, Churchill has scarcely known personal popularity. Now, with each new ordeal, it soared. Newsreels showed him touring the troops, stumping the warship gangplanks, inspecting gigantic guns, acknowledging with flamboyant upward sweep of his square pork pie hat the cheers of the bystanders. Recently, the enemy transmitters had begun to rouse the workers against him, but these violent air raids gave him the chance to drive to their stricken suburbs and show himself to the newly bereaved and homeless, flicking Havana ash onto the glass-strewn sidewalks and waving his walking stick. 7,000 Londoners would die during the remainder of September 1940, including 700 children. This was the price of Churchill's popularity. He had gauged the British mood exactly. By October 1940, Gallup pollsters would see his popularity rating soar to 89%. 89%. It stayed there right the way through the war because he was able to engineer it. No such thing as public opinion. Until that first, of course, this stoical, suffering people couldn't know that for reasons of grand strategy, he and Bomber Command had done their utmost to induce this very outrage. Nor that there was worse to come, nor that the carnage would last 4 more years. A time bomb closed Regent Street for 2 days, Selfridges lost its windows, John Lewis burnt out. Everybody was at risk. The richer homes collapsed into larger heaps of rubble. That was the only difference. Their Majesties no longer slept in town, but in Windsor Castle, which was as well because on September the 9th, the first bomb hit their London palace. Most nights, a fresh draw was held in this lethal lottery, and it unified those brave enough to remain in London. A newfound courage in adversity pervaded them, transcending class barriers and obscuring the old party distinctions. Through this rising chaos came, lisping and snuffling, the familiar voice of Mr. Churchill, broadcasting bravely to the nation, steady and reassuring, promising victory, and crying revenge. It would take 10 years at the present rate for half the houses of London to be demolished, he calculated. After that, of course, progress would be much slower. Typical Winston Churchill, we all remember these broadcast speeches by Churchill because they're available on television, on cassette, on video cassette, in the endless television series and Hollywood reproductions now. Churchill, the Wilderness Years, Churchill, the Finest Hour, and so on. And when I tell audiences, I tell you now that that voice that we remember, the famous voice is, "We shall fight them on the beaches," says Churchill, knowing, of course, from code breaking that Hitler has no intention of invading Britain, because Hitler is already planning to attack Russia. Churchill knew it, but he persuaded us the whole way through that summer that we were prone to invasion, because it suited his book to keep the British people in terror. We will fight them on the beach, or the other one, and if the British Empire and its Commonwealth should last for 1,000 years, people will still say this was their finest hour. When I tell British audiences and American audiences that the voice that you hear and heard and have in your memory was not the voice of Churchill at all, because he was incapable in the evenings of 1940 to broadcast. He couldn't go down to a broadcasting house in Oxford Street and make the broadcasts that were required of him. And so a BBC actor had to stand in and make the broadcasts for him. A BBC actor noted for his best mimicry of Churchill, a man called Norman Shelley. Those of you who are English will know the man, in fact. Norman Shelley was the one who every evening, 5 p.m., children's hour, he played the part of Larry the Lamb. I knew Norman Shelley well. He died 2 or 3 years ago. He told me the whole story before he died about how he was called in to make the Churchill broadcasts because Churchill in the evenings of 1940 was in no condition to speak on the radio. So the voice, the amusing thing is in Australia, one station after another on the radio prefaced my interview with that particular broadcast. So I said to the listeners as soon as the recording had ended, unfortunately, that voice you have been thrilling to wasn't Winston Churchill's at all. People were easily duped, but not everybody. There was one man who sent a telegram to number 10 Downing Street on the morning after one such spurious broadcast saying, "Winston, you must look after yourself a bit better. I listened in to you last night and you didn't sound yourself." Well, he didn't sound himself because he wasn't himself. He was Larry the Lamb that night. And I know it's funny, and I know we laugh about it, but not all of us. I remember in some of the English audiences, particularly in the bush out in Australia, where there's a large recent English immigrants population, or in Kelowna, where I'm speaking tomorrow, day after tomorrow, outside Vancouver. I've seen it happen. When I get to that part of the talk, and I say how the speech wasn't Churchill, he wasn't capable of speaking, it was really a BBC actor mimicking in Kelowna, I saw one couple get up and walk out. Not in a sense of outrage. They very quietly got up from their seats at this moment. In the back of the audience, they got up and walked out because they just couldn't take it anymore. They couldn't take what I was saying anymore, not because they were disgusted with what I was saying, they were disgusted with themselves for having believed for 45 years everything that they had been suckered into believing. The illusion, the warm bath of illusions that we have been gulled into living in. The bath had begun to run cold. Somebody had turned on the cold tap, and it was time to get up and get out and go out into the real outside world and start asking questions about who did it and why. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this half hour or so that I've been talking to you, you've got a bit of a suspicion as to who did it and who were the ones behind Winston Churchill and why they forced Britain into this war willy-nilly. In 1939, we placed Britain's empire's future in the hands of the Poles, who had, of course, not the slightest interest in the British Empire's future prosperity. 1940, we placed it in the hands of other people. 1941, we placed it in the hands of the Americans. We placed our empire's future well-being in the hands of everybody but the British people, because the British people were never told what was really at stake. The fact that we had had a peace offer made to us in the summer of 1940 that was so generous that it surpasses belief almost. A peace offer that would undoubtedly have been maintained, because we now know from the German archives that all this time Hitler was planning to attack the Soviet Union. And there are people in Australia and New Zealand who said to me, Mr. Irving, how cynical and callous of you to say what you're expecting us to say is therefore turn Hitler loose on the Soviet Union and let the British Empire survive. And I would say, yes, that's precisely what I say. I could have cared. Why should we go fighting other people's battles for them? If the Poles have upset the Germans, or if the Jews have upset the Germans, Germans have upset the Jews, or the Germans have upset the Russians, or whatever it is, those are private squabbles and nothing whatever to do with the British. Why couldn't we have learned in 1939 what we've learned in the hard way in the 1960s and 1970s? You can't spend the rest of your life poking your nose into somebody else's squabbles. We did it in 1939, and the result was we lost everything that 300 years of British energy and industry had created. The Americans, of course, you learned it the hard way in Vietnam. You can't keep on doing it. And there's always somebody who has got the glib tongue and the silver oratory to persuade you to do things which in the long run turn out to have been against your most fundamental interests. These are the lessons that we learn. But people aren't going to learn them unless they have the archives and the books that they can trust. The whole of the academic university institution, unfortunately, runs in the opposite direction. The propaganda machine begins to run during war. It turns out the lies, as of course lies have to be said in war, and nobody puts his hand on the wheel to stop it, because he doesn't want to. Nobody has an interest in stopping the flywheel spinning. So the lies continue. The legends, whatever it is, the mythologies continue. And everybody makes a fast buck out of whichever legends have been created. And the person whose job it is to find out the truth and tell it, the historian, he doesn't do it because he's frightened of losing his job if he's at university. He's frightened of being locked up if he's in Germany. He's frightened of bankruptcy if he's an author like myself, because not everybody can afford to do what I've done, which is spend 10 years of my life researching the truth in the hope that finally I'll find a publisher with the guts to publish it. Because I didn't, of course. This is the great, extraordinary tragedy at the end of 10 years working on this. I'm a reputable British author. My books are published by publishing houses of great fame and repute around the whole world. Macmillan's, the Viking Press, Doubleday, Putnam's, Little Brown. All my books have been published by the most reputable publishing houses until we came to this one. And then suddenly they seem to imply, Mr. Irving, you've gone off the rails. You haven't learned how to write. You haven't learned your lesson, perhaps, of what they're saying. You should have learned your lesson over the Hitler book. You see what happened there, as your agent warned you. If you did keep up this absurd pretense that Hitler didn't know what was going on and that there was this colossal event, if you do keep, as my agent warned you, they said if you do keep this up, then you're going to lose the Reader's Digest, the Book of the Month Club deal, the Military History Book Club, the paperback deals in New York. You're going to lose $1 or $2 million. And I did keep it up, and we lost the $1 or $2 million. And I didn't mind, because I took the philosophical view: what you haven't had, you don't miss. My agent, of course, missed his 10% of what I didn't have, and he hasn't been entirely happy about it. And he's not exactly put his back into finding a publisher for this one, which is why we've done it the other way round. When I was stuck in the tunnel, ladies and gentlemen, after 9 years of work on this book, Churchill's War, and those of you who ever tried writing something of any length at all will know what I mean by the tunnel, when you can't see daylight behind you where you started or daylight ahead where the book's going to come out. You're stuck in this velvety black tunnel and you think you're never going to see the light of day, and I shelved it. I said to myself, if you write another 1 year on this 9-year book, 10 years to complete it, you're going to be bankrupt. Because the overheads continue, you've got bills, you've got school fees, all these things have to be paid. You'll be bankrupt. So I shelved it. And I'm stuck in the tunnel when out of the darkness ahead came this little Australian saddle tank engine, you know, the kind that goes around the shunting yards. And this outback voice said, I think I can help you. This was a couple of years back. I don't know where he came from, Ray White of Veritas. In fact, when I flew down to Perth 5 weeks ago, not having ever seen the book, knowing only that I'd trusted 10 years of my life into his hands, without a contract, no agreement, nothing, just a handshake. I gave him the manuscript as an honest man, and I said, here you are, 10 years of my life. And when he met me at Perth Airport on September the 11th this year, 5 a.m. in the morning, and he handed this book to me, I couldn't believe the magnificent production job the Australians have done, and it really is an extraordinary job. You won't see production jobs like that in the bookshops now, silk-bound with markers and all the rest of it. But we insisted on that. We said we're cutting out all the middlemen. We're doing this ourselves. We're doing the finest production job. We're passing on the benefits of the bucks to the readers, so they get a really good job on acid-free paper, which will last 1,000 years. This will last 1,000 years, this book. Not like the other ones. The other ones will crumble to pulp in 10 years. This is the consolation, of course. They may cost a bit more, and the authors may be rich, but their books will vanish, and this one will survive. So I gave him the 10 years product of my life, and I said, you do what you can with it, but let's see if we can't really make a splash with it. I'll put my back into it, and I'll do whatever you say. So we ended up publishing the book Down Under, taking the old world by surprise. If you go to Australia or New Zealand, ladies and gentlemen, you look in the bookshelves there now, and you'll find that 95% of the books in the Australian and New Zealand bookshops come from up here, Britain and America. So we've done it the other way around. We printed a book in Australia, and we're exporting it by containers, by air freight, all the way around the English-speaking world. London doesn't know what's about to hit it. November the 2nd is the date. You watch. November the 2nd, we have hired HMS Belfast, a cruiser in the middle of the Thames, and we're having a reception there on board this cruiser with 200 invited British journalists to launch this book. And around the room is going to be a battery of television sets playing the Australian and New Zealand television programs, where they tried to floor me. Night after night after night on primetime television, they called in all the big guns, and they couldn't do it. And that's going to be there just to tell the British journalists, this, we've come in through the back door, you see. Like all those 6 million people who came into England over the last, we've come in through the back door of the world with this book. In fact, we come in through Western Australia, which I suppose is the back door of the back door. We've come in with this book, and they can't avoid it now, because the period of initial risk is over. The initial risk was the first 2 or 3 days. Will the Australian press ignore it? You know the way they can. A blanket of silence. Don't let's say anything about Irving's book. It will vanish, and it will bankrupt Veritas once and for all, and Irving probably can't afford the fare back to London. Boy, this is the big chance. They didn't do it. They didn't realize until too late that we were in, and suddenly we're there, coast-to-coast television, right the way across Australia, right the way across all the radio broadcasting stations. We were turning up in the little outback towns. We had truckloads of books going around. And all the big bookstores like Angus and Robertson and Collins and Graham's right the way across Australia, who said, originally, we don't deal with minor publishers. Now they're battering a party's door saying, can we have another 200, please? Urgently, we're running out. And the good news was 3 weeks ago that suddenly we appeared as number 3 on the non-fiction hardback bestseller list. And then the week after that, number one on the hardback non-fiction bestseller list in Australia. And this week, we're number. It is an extraordinary achievement. A publishing house that in Australia nobody has ever heard of now has the number 3 position right across the country in all the books being sold in Australia. He is the number 3 bestseller. It's an extraordinary achievement. I mean, we know that here in Australia, here in the United States, there are fringe groups. There are fringe groups everywhere. This is no longer a fringe operation, a publishing house that can get a book into the number 3 position in a major country like Australia, and believe me, New Zealand is going to follow this week too. I've no doubt at all about that. We have really big media coverage behind me. I just came up from New Zealand yesterday. We have whole page articles about it in all the New Zealand newspapers this last week. So the same thing's going to happen there. The same thing's going to happen in Canada. The same thing's going to happen in Britain when I get back on November the 2nd, and then down to South Africa for 2 weeks in the middle of November. And I think we've done it. And next year I told them all, reserve a spot for me next September because I'm coming back. You see? So they can't prevent it. And after that, we've got a long line. Mr. Ray White and I know what we're planning next. We have all sorts of further books planned that are going to come through this case-hardened new channel that we have opened up. And believe me, this is a clean, stainless steel channel. We're not pouring out filth, we're not pouring out rubbish, we're not pouring out extremist literature. This is the truth that's being poured out, which is what Veritas, of course, means. It's a great, great achievement. Back to Churchill, a few concluding remarks. I'm not anti-Churchill to the extent that I hate him pathologically. He had, of course, major positive aspects. He was a great wit, a great raconteur, a great writer, quite a good, accomplished painter as well. I rather like his facility of instant repartee. You know, the one-liners that he would deliver, not having been written for him by some smart comedian in Brooklyn, but coming from the bottom of his soul, 80 or 90 years of experience. Tom Dryburgh, the notorious homosexual member of Parliament, Soviet agent, in fact, got married. A photograph of the future Mrs. Tom Dryburgh, a hideously ugly woman, was brought into Winston Churchill in the smoking room of the house. And he looked at this rather unpleasant, homely photograph of the future Mrs. Tom Dryburgh, wife of a homosexual member of Parliament, and Winston Churchill said, well, I suppose beggars can't be choosers. but he didn't say beggars. Lord Montague of Bewley. Lord Montague of Bewley, a very famous English, another poofter, I'm afraid. I don't know where this comes from, but it does seem to be around in England. Lord Montague of Bewley was arraigned before the Old Bailey, up for trial on charges of having interfered or molested with, or had some kind of relations with young Boy Scouts who were visiting his estate. He was acquitted, astonishingly enough. I suppose another example of that old aphorism that British justice is the best that money can buy. Lord Montague of Bewley was acquitted. The headlines pronounced Lord Montague acquitted were brought into Winston Churchill in the House. He looked at the headlines, Lord Montague acquitted, and he looked up and he said, "If I had my way, I would have that man cast into a bottomless pit." Think about it. Finally, Winston Churchill, he had these quirks. In June 19... Yes, you just got it, madam. Winston Churchill, in June 1940, one of his little quirks was he said, "I think we're going to have Britain and France become one nation. Britain and France will become one nation, one citizenship, one currency, one head of state, I'm not sure which, one army with General de Gaulle in command." All this was decided by Winston Churchill in 2 dramatic days, which I've described in great detail here, June the 12th, June the 13th, 1940. You won't find it in the British archives, of course, because it's a bit embarrassing. Churchill didn't tell His Majesty the King he was doing this. The King didn't find out he was nearly going to have 40 or 50 million French subjects. It's all rather confusing. Churchill already sitting on the train in Waterloo Station in London, going down to Portsmouth to board the battleship to go to the Bay of Biscay to meet the French president, to sign the documents making Britain and France one country. When he got the news, sitting on board the train, waiting for the train to leave, that France had just capitulated to the Germans. So that was that. 5 years later, he does the same with the Americans. And on the wall of the apartment in New York of Mrs. Ronald Tree, I found this strange postcard. I've got it in colour in my room, and I forgot to bring it, but you see this little postcard here, on the back of which Winston Churchill has designed the future currency of the Anglo-American country. Britain and America will become one country. American citizens will become British, a great benefit to you. British citizens will become American. Not sure if we'd all relish that. Perhaps the idea was that we would become the 51st nation. I'm not sure. Anyway, Churchill rushed ahead, and he designed on the back of a postcard the new Anglo-American currency. You've not seen it before because, of course, he was spared this. It's an example, in fact, of Winston Churchill's best. He's designed, it's a pound sign riding on the back of a dollar, if you look at it closely. The pound dollar, I suppose. The pound dollar. If you look at it closely, in fact, you can see it afterwards if you come up and have your book signed. I think the pound has got its arms clutched tightly round the dollar. I think the pound has got its legs around the dollar too, but I'm not sure that is true. This may be... I think the pound might possibly be committing with the dollar the kind of indecent offence that used to be a prerequisite for joining His Majesty's Secret Service. This is Winston Churchill's idea of the future Anglo-American currency. How do we leave him? Well, 1963, I suppose, the last day he goes to the House of Commons. The entire House of Commons knows it's going to be the last time they ever see the grand old boy. At the end of the day, he walks down the aisle of the House, and all the members of Parliament stand on their seats waving their order papers and cheering, and he totters down the House, down the aisle, supported by 2 Conservative members of Parliament. John Langford Holt is one of them. I have his diary. And as he gets to the end of the aisle, he pauses briefly, and 2 members of Parliament at the other end of the aisle, one turns to the other and says, "Look at that. Poor old boy. Gone completely gaga, hasn't he?" And Churchill stopped in his tracks like this, and he swayed, and he cast off the 2 members of Parliament supporting him as though he was the QE2 getting rid of the tugs supporting him in the Hudson River. And he turned round and he said, "Yes, and there are some who say he's as deaf as a post." Poor old Winston Churchill. He thought he had done it. He thought he'd pulled it off by writing the 6-volume history of the war. He was going to be writing the history of the war, and he was going to make sure that he was the one who got everything right. There are ways, if you have the time and the patience, to encircle the gaps in the archives and find out what really happened. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that with my book, Churchill's War, of which this is only volume 1, the second half follows next year, I think that we, on the free right, have managed to find out for the first time the truth about what happened in that ghastly tragedy of the Second World War. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take questions, and may I stress that you have questions. We don't want speeches, and I'd suggest that Mr. Irving takes them as he sees them.
May I also say, first of all, that of course after the questions I shall stay behind for a long time signing books and answering any private questions you may have. On the back, yes, sir. Winston Churchill was the focus, you mean? Well, of course, the same kind of troubles exist even now. We can't deny that the Jewish community at large feels threatened enough to employ their money power to make life very difficult for people whom they perceive in their ignorance as being their real enemy. And they make life difficult for me. All the way around New Zealand and Australia, I have been asked the question, Mr. Irving, are you anti-Jewish? And I have said this is a basic logical mistake that you make. Because the Jews are anti-Irving does not mean to say that Irving is anti-Jew. And in fact, it isn't the Jews, it's just some Jews. Most of the Jewish community are perfectly law-abiding citizens who don't go around committing the crimes that some Jews have committed against me. The ones who committed the crimes against me, like sledgehammering my front door or burning down printing works or raiding my apartment disguised as telephone engineers, whatever. I mean, one even came to my flat 10 years ago and produced a badge of Mossad from his pocket. I'll name him. He was, in fact, the very well-known British television actor Carlos Thompson, wife of Vivian Lee, wife of, not Vivian Lee, I've forgotten the one, but a very well-known English actress. These things happen to me. These methods are used to intimidate me. These are crimes. The ones who were caught have been sent to prison for it for a very long time, but I don't blame the entire Jewish community for doing it. But it's the symptomatic of the manner in which our opponents are very well organized on one particular sector. They are opposed to the truth about certain aspects of World War II becoming known. They don't want it to become known, and so they use criminal means to prevent the truth from becoming known. And all the time they present themselves in a holier than possible light. You only have to consider Mr. Ivan Boesky, for example, in this country. Ivan Boesky, who is probably one of the richest men on the East Coast, at the time of his little trouble last year, it came out that he had not only put up $250,000 to the New York Ballet in return if they would stage a ballet based on the Holocaust. I'm afraid that rather boggled my mind when I read that. I can't quite understand how they could do a ballet based on the Holocaust, but this is what the New York Times told us. And it also turned out that he's one of the leading financiers behind the Holocaust Memorial Commission in both Washington and New York. And that is big money, of course, that is there potentially available for distorting the truth in a certain direction, for bending the truth in a certain direction. So the problem which existed in 1936 with Winston Churchill being hired to operate in a certain direction exists even now with journalists being hired. And so we've seen in Australia certain journalists, it's quite obvious from their articles where they got the information from that they were using. It's the same old distorted and untrue information that I've had trouble with for the last 30 years. But they come out and they use this, and the average reader thinks they've found it out independently. It isn't. It's just part of the same old paid smear campaign.
Will your book be published in Germany?
It is being published in Germany by the German publishing house Rowohlt, which is one of the biggest and most reputable German liberal publishing houses. But not until we had some very serious troubles in Germany. The first publishing house caved in under pressure and cancelled the contract. The second publishing house, Rowohlt, the workers, the trades unions organizing the workers in that publishing house have instructed the management that they will go on strike if they really try to print my book. So that's going to be the next 6 months in Germany. Yes, Mr. Hogan.
Would you comment on whether or not you feel that Rudolf Hess was murdered, and would you also in general comment on the passing of an age or what this symbolizes in his 40 years of imprisonment?
Rudolf Hess. It'll come as a surprise to you perhaps that in 2 weeks' time I have a book being published by Macmillan's, a very established English publishing house, called Rudolf Hess, The Missing Years. Because going through the archives in the United States last year in Suitland, Maryland, I came across, oddly enough, a box full of British secret papers which shouldn't have been there. They are clearly British papers. They are of British origin. If they were in Britain, these papers would be closed until the next century, but I immediately made photocopies of the entire box, of course. And this is the whole history of what happened to Rudolf Hess after he arrived in Britain. It's a very sad story indeed. It shows the methods we used, most of them criminal, to try and persuade him to talk. Methods of psychological torture, psychological warfare, chemotherapy, truth drugs, with the result that he obviously became very unstable and very ill at the end of it. I've reproduced these documents in that book. It's already just been published in Germany, and the English publishing house Macmillan are publishing it. To answer your question, whether Rudolf Hess killed himself, I think it most unlikely that he killed himself for various reasons. The first reason is a straightforward forensic reason. The reason why we should all be dissatisfied with the official version is that there wasn't an official version. There were half a dozen different official versions which seemed to change with the date on the calendar. Each day a new version came out, diametrically opposed to the previous version. First he died, Second, he had killed himself. Thirdly, he had killed himself in the garden. Fourthly, he had killed himself indoors. Then he was found with a piece of flex round his neck. Then it was said the neck was found fixed to a window frame. Then it was said that he had strangled himself, and so on. And then finally, in order to quieten public opinion, the British authorities released the fact, but not the text, of a letter having been written, a farewell letter. Well, I can only say that in my researches on Hess, I found the text of probably 10 farewell letters that he wrote over the 40 years that he was in captivity. He occasionally got very depressed and he sat down and he wrote a farewell letter to his family, sometimes even indicating he was going to try and take his life, as he did try 2 times in British captivity and several times in Spandau. So these letters existed in British files in Spandau from the war years right through to the end of his life, and it's no great feat for the British and Americans to take a letter out of the files and say a farewell letter was found. And I think the very fact that they haven't released the text of it, let alone the date of the farewell letter, makes it very suspicious. If they had said, we found a farewell letter dated August the 17th or August the 16th, the day before he committed suicide allegedly, then I would believe it. But no, it's just a farewell letter. So I think they were frantically scratching around the bottom of the barrel to try and find something to substantiate their story. My own suspicion, and I emphasize that it's only a suspicion, given the fact that I think it unlikely that a 93-year-old man could strangle himself with a piece of wire, my own suspicion is that he was probably killed by one of the American guards. And we can only speculate on why. Either an act of mercy or an act of malice. Perhaps some guard who had been hyped up by watching television programs on the Holocaust. I don't know. But that, I emphasize, is pure speculation based on the fact that I don't believe the official version. Right at the back.
No, I never had anything good to say about Roosevelt tonight.
You never had anything good to say about Roosevelt till tonight, yes?
A couple of weeks ago, I got a guy named Sully Whiskey who's coming over here from Russia. And if I find out that Roosevelt takes Stalin, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do.
Yeah. Well, I think there's no sense keeping secret the fact that after Churchill's war, Roosevelt's war is following. That's the book which I'm writing now. Roosevelt's war comes after that. I'm having great trouble finding an American publisher, but I have no fear that the book will not reach the Americans. It certainly will, because we now have ways of doing this. And Roosevelt, I have to say, from the strictly limited, narrow American point of view, is probably the best president you've had this century. When you consider the nation that he found when he came to office in 1933 and what he left when he died in April 1945, it's the methods that one disapproves of, and he did it at the expense of the British. But from the strictly American limited point of view, that was that. But you'll find also, incidentally, in Volume 2 of this, when we meet next September, we'll be talking about Pearl Harbor, because we've got some very good, very interesting new material on Pearl Harbor, which again purely shows up the other academic historians through whose hands this material has gone, but they haven't spotted it. Yes.
The rationalization, as I understand, of the United States under World War I was the torpedoing of the Lusitania.
Yes.
There was a program, there was a series on American television a few years ago called Churchill, and by Leonard Nimoy was the narrator. I don't know if you've seen this particular one. But the Lusitania was known to be carrying war material. The Germans posted signs all over New York saying, don't travel over this torpedo,
Yes.
it's illegal. It was, according to the program, it was taken to Britain, and the destroyer escort was pulled off. It was allowed to go south of Ireland, where the German Wolfpack was known to be
Yes.
there to torpedo the boat. They had a sister ship, which had also been torpedoed, but did not blow up and sink. And it looks like a setup.
Yes.
And the respective secretaries of the navies were Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the United States
And Winston Churchill.
Churchill for Britain. Were you aware of that?
Oh yes, well aware of this, but of course, to say that the United States came into the Second World War because of the Lusitania incident, that was just a very small trigger which is needed to dupe public opinion, just like Pearl Harbor. You need things like that to gull the public into getting as mad as hell. And Churchill was very good at that. In fact, in World War II, as you'll find from this volume, he used his knowledge of the German U-boat positions. He knew exactly where the German U-boats were from the code-breaking operation. And he used his knowledge of that to make sure that American convoys were routed right into the path of the German U-boats at the time before Pearl Harbor, so that he was trying the whole time to get the Americans into the war by tricks like that. The Lusitania episode hasn't been entirely satisfactorily cleared up. The wreckage, I think in that TV program you're talking about, the wreckage was actually investigated by underwater camera, and it was found that recent work had been done on the underwater wreck to remove certain gun mountings and things. And the Admiralty in Britain was very angry that the television cameras were allowed near this. So there's a lot still unexplained about that. But it would be wrong to imagine the Americans just come into war because of Lusitania or the sinking of Roosevelt. In September 1938, when he was asked by one of his cabinet, is the Czech crisis dangerous for the United States or good? Roosevelt's reply, which I quoted in this book, I think, quoted by the Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, his diaries in the Library of Congress, Roosevelt replied, any war or any crisis in Europe at this moment can only benefit the United States. Already the gold of the European nations is flooding across the Atlantic at a rate so fast that we don't have enough warships to carry it. And that's the real reason why wars get fought. Economic reasons and trade reasons. And I've never seen that particular quotation referred to anywhere else, and mine is the first book to use it, possibly because the Ickes diary, you've got to read 13 or 14 microfilms of diary pages until you get to little nuggets like that. Yes?
I want to know what the story is on Everett, the former Prince of Wales. Didn't he want to, after the war started, didn't he want to see Hitler, to see he could do something, but the British
Oh, yes.
let him?
Oh, you've got 2 or 3 chapters on the Duke of Windsor, or the King Edward VIII, as he was. King Edward VIII was forced to abdicate in December 1936. He was forced to abdicate, not really because of marrying an American divorcee, Mrs. Simpson. He was forced to abdicate basically because he was too pro-German for the likings of the British Foreign Office. He was secretly dealing with the German ambassador, Hirsch, and I've quoted bits of that in this book. In 1940, when he was in France, the Germans invaded France. The Duke of Windsor then took refuge in Spain and then subsequently in Portugal. And Winston Churchill, who had by that time become Prime Minister, learned from code breaking the things that the Duke was saying to the Italian ambassador, the Spanish government, and to the German ambassador in Madrid and Lisbon, because Churchill was reading the telegrams these people were sending. He was just decoding them. You see, code breaking is the whole secret of what Churchill was up to. And Churchill sent a Scotland Yard detective with an armed revolver to Lisbon to instruct the Duke to board the ship which was going to take him out of harm's way to the Bahamas, and with orders to shoot him if he didn't. A lot of the papers on the Duke of Windsor are closed. In British files, you can't see them, but if you know the Italian archives and the Spanish archives, you can see the telegrams that Churchill was reading. So you can fill in the picture. If you do the work, you see, I found the Italian archives in Rome and the Italian Foreign Office archives, and the bundles of telegrams I was reading had never been opened by anyone else, because as I opened the bundles, they actually fell apart in my hands. They were so ancient, and the string just crumbled away. I was the first and last person to read those telegrams. But I've got them on microfilm, and I've used them in this book. Yes. Yes.
Would you comment on the book by the British relating to the effect that Rudolph Hess now was not prevailed?
Would I comment on the book by Hugh Thomas, the British physician in Spandau, called The Murder of Rudolph Hess, where he makes the allegation that at some time the real Rudolph Hess had been switched for an imposter. It's a very clever book, and I've got to take my hat off to an author who can maintain this right the way through a book, because it's such an improbable story. And on the face of it, unlikely, because why should anybody have done that? What was the point of it? And why should anybody have then sat on in Spandau for 47 years, including 27 years in solitary confinement, if he wasn't the real man? He'd have to be nuts. I did investigate it. I got hold of from these American records I was referring to earlier. I found that they included Rudolf Hess's 1941 dental chart, you know, a chart of his mouth, his upper and lower jaw. And that is absolute 100% identification evidence, for example, in plane crashes. So I sent a photocopy of that dental chart to Spandau prison earlier this year, and I asked the Allied authorities, each of them, French, Russian, British, and American, to compare that with the dental chart of their prisoner, Rudolf Hess, and give me their comments. And the British refused to comment. The Americans replied finally in July this year, a month before Rudolf Hess died. The colonel of the American Army Dental Corps, who is in fact the colonel who personally treats Rudolf Hess, said that he wanted to comment, but he had been instructed by the governors of Spandau prison that I am not permitted to impart any information to you concerning the dental records of prisoner number 7. It's as bad as that. And of course, 1 year later, prisoner number 7 died. So we can only speculate. My own view is that it's admittedly mysterious, because the personnel file of Hess does show that he was wounded in the left lung in 1917 in July, a rifle bullet, and yet there's no evidence of such an injury in the lung of the man as X-rayed in Britain and in Spandau. but I think there must be some other simple explanation. Possibly he was even faking his World War I injury. It's as simple as that. And also I've got the handwriting all the way through from 1920 onwards, right through to the 1950s, and there's not the slightest change in the handwriting. And the British records that I refer to, the ones I found in America, include a minute-by-minute, day-by-day account of everything that Rudolf Hess is doing, eating, saying, all his personal bodily emotions, everything. 2,000 pages of it. There's not a single gap, so there couldn't have been a switch.
You also comment on the book by the American Army officer later for a while, I think the name is
Colonel Eugene Byrd. Colonel Eugene Byrd, who now lives in Berlin, was the commandant in Spandau. He wrote a book in conjunction with an Australian writer called Desmond Zwar on Rudolf Hess, and called Prisoner Number 7, I think. And that was published a few years back. Eugene Byrd was dismissed from the American Army for having betrayed information that he had gained as commandant of Spandau. Zwar took refuge in Cairns in the Northern Territories of Australia, and that is all that can be said about that. I've read the book. It's interesting because it contains some of the diaries of Rudolf Hess that he wrote in Spandau and in Nuremberg. And oddly enough, a man turned up in England a few months ago and showed me the original diaries and asked for a huge sum of money for them, and also had 7 tape recordings of Rudolf Hess, which had been made in his cell in Spandau quite recently. And I listened to the tape recordings, and it's quite an eerie experience to hear this man talking. Oh, it is, yes. No question. Somebody at the back there. Tyler Kent, the case of Tyler Kent. In fact, there was a very good article on Tyler Kent in the Journal of the Institute of Historical Review about a year ago. Tyler Kent was an American cipher clerk in the American Embassy in London in 1940. He'd previously been in Moscow. Very junior cipher clerk. He took to reading the messages passing through his hands and found to his astonishment in early 1940 that a very junior British minister, the Minister of the Navy, namely Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, was privately corresponding with President Roosevelt using the American Embassy in London as his channel. And Tyler Kent considered that this was evidence of a breach of neutrality by President Roosevelt, and he decided to make these telegrams available to British members of Parliament, including Captain Ramsay, who was subsequently locked up, and also to members of Congress. But before he could do this, Scotland Yard pounced. They had been intercepting his telephone calls, and on May the 21st, 1940, Tyler Kent was arrested. The whole of the British file on this is in the archives in Suitland, Maryland, where I photocopied it. So I had the whole of the file on that. Since I photocopied it, the British government has requested that file to be closed again, so you can no longer see it. So if you want to see it, come and see me in London. I've got it. Yes.
Could you comment on the German nerve gas and biofacility?
Well, this is a very good question. Somebody was saying to me on television in Australia only a few days ago, it's quite obvious, Mr. Irving, that if the war had continued, Adolf Hitler would have had the atom bomb, and we can only assume there's no reason at all that he wouldn't have used it. So I said, there's a perfectly good reason that he didn't use it, why he wouldn't use it. And he said, why? The man was a madman. He would have used whatever weapon he got his hands on. So I said, are you aware that the Germans, by the end of World War II, had manufactured 30,000 tons of nerve gas, sarin and tabun, which are the nerve gases now used by the Soviets in Angola, for example. And he said, well, I heard about it. So I said, well, think about it. 30,000 tons of nerve gases that would have penetrated any British or American gas mask. If Hitler had given the order for that to be used, he could have wiped out the bridgehead in Normandy. He could have pulled out his armored divisions and sent them against Russia. He could have won the war, effectively. But Hitler had repeatedly said from 1940 onwards, I refuse to be the first to use poison gases. Now, how does this jibe with your picture of Adolf Hitler? And this, of course, is the kind of logical question that they are just not equipped to answer. They're so familiar with the Hollywood Madison Avenue version of Hitler that they cannot find an answer to that question. How do we explain that Adolf Hitler, as we know him, refused to use the weapon which would have won the war? The answer is because, as Hitler himself said, we have signed the Geneva Convention that we will not be the first to use it. Winston Churchill, on July the 6th, 1944, in a drunken cabinet meeting, we know he was drunk from the private diary of the Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Cunningham, ordered the use of poison gas against the Germans in Normandy, confidently thinking that we British had poison gas and that the Germans couldn't use it because they didn't have an air force. Well, the answer is that if we had used poison gas in Normandy in response to Churchill's order on July the 6th, 1944, Hitler would then have felt free to use nerve gases and it might have turned the war. This is all in volume 2 of the book. You'll find the whole of the unknown story of the poison gases.
I have one more question. Did your research uncover any connection between the House of Rothschild and the Jewish International creation of these wars?
the House of Rothschild and the Jewish international bankers in the creation of these wars. The only research that I've discovered about Rothschild is connected with various stocks and shares that they held in the Witkowitz iron and steel works, which plays an extraordinary role in the middle of Europe at that time. And the Nazis wanted the iron and steel works, and they were busy buying up all the shares, and then they got their hands on this particular Baron Rothschild in Austria, and they held him hostage to persuade the Rothschild family to release the remaining shares and so on. It's an international family, of course. It isn't just one family. It has many nationalities. It turns up in many, many guises. And they are wealthy beyond belief. They are rich beyond the dreams of avarice. And people who have more money than they know is good for them are very dangerous indeed. One mustn't underestimate their ability to influence people, opinions, and events. But more than that, I'm not really prepared to say, because I haven't researched the House of Rothschild, just as I haven't researched the Holocaust. So,
Do you plan to do that in the future?
no, because I am not tired of life.
All right.